Well, there's no mystery to where this one is, or is there? Welcome back to Nate the Hoof Guy. Let's go back to the beginning. Right here is the first signs of a problem in this claw. So we'll see as it progresses where it ends up. On the last video, someone commented on the thickness of the blade that I was using to trim. Well, when I start, I use one of these thick bladed knives. That's what they look like when they're brand new. When I do some lesion work, then I'll use that thinner blade. This thicker blade, I'm able to take off bigger chunks. It's just a more robust blade, and I use that for some of this rough work. Take note once again where that mark is now and where it eventually ends up. Today's video once again consists of 3 different trims, and all of these trims are going to better explain what these marks are that we see in the soles of the cow's foot and how to read those marks as far as their significance and whether or not we need to remove them and things like that. Which ones are problematic, and be able to get a better view of how I make those decisions with each one of these trims. Once again, notice that mark and notice how it's moving. Now is when I bring out that thinner bladed knife. Now at each station on my chute, I've got multiple different knives so I can switch off in between them. For each of the front feet is one station for each of those feet, and then at the back feet, that's one station as well. I've got multiple knives there. That way it's easy. When I pick that foot up and I've got to do those first few cuts to remove some of those larger pieces, some of that debris, that's when that thick knife comes out. When I need to do some finer knife work, I just grab the other knife. When you find a big mark in a claw like this, especially one with fluid, it's pretty easy to know that you need to chase that mark down, right? The trim that's coming up next, there's a lot of big marks that you'll see in that claw, but not necessarily any of them are problematic, just based on being able to read that claw. Here you can see that mark has got some shading up underneath there. This one's definitely problematic, so we're going to keep going on that. But the size of the mark has nothing to do with necessarily the problem that's going to be underneath. In fact, some of the largest flaws you see in the claw may just be superficial marks, superficial flaws. Nothing that is actually structural that goes all the way to the corium. It's being able to read that foot and being able to see that to make those decisions on which marks you need to chase down. Notice how far this mark has moved already. I've talked many times about why these marks in the soles aren't necessarily where the lesions are, but I'll give you a quick rundown again. When we have a flaw that's happening at the corium level, that flaw will eventually start to grow out over time. So as it grows out, it's going to move down that claw as well. Now, if it's a persistent problem that's affecting that area, then over time, that mark is eventually, or that flaw that we have at the corium level is eventually going to make it all the way to the outside and be exposed to the elements, which is then going to make it susceptible, get it to having bacteria enter it and cause problems. If it's a temporary problem or a problem that just happens one time, then you may end up seeing a black mark or a mark in that sole when you trim it, but that may not necessarily travel all the way to the corium because that problem wasn't persistent. That flaw in that white line wasn't persistent over time. So you may have a flaw for a short period of time, but if that problem is resolved, then that hoof horn, those layers that follow that are going to be sound layers, and you're not going to see any marks in those layers. So that's why you might have a situation where we trim that foot, you can see a mark, but with a few knife strokes, that mark disappears. That's because that it wasn't a persistent problem that was causing that defect in that white line. It was something that happened just one time. Maybe she slipped. Maybe that caused a little bit of a flaw where it was that hoof horn was forming there, but it wasn't something that was persistent that caused that white line to be flawed for a long period of time. So that's kind of how we read those. And I can tell usually based on what they look like, whether or not those flaws are of that nature or not. If they are a long-term problem, they tend to be a little bit wider. You can tend to see the width and depth of that crack. You can tell that it's problematic, and you can also tell based on locations. A lot of the marks we see in these claws are in locations where we don't typically find defects, so that's another thing that tips us off that they're probably not problematic. See these little white areas? That's real thin, soft hoof horn, so I got to work really carefully along those edges. Some of those I'm going to leave in place if they are in vulnerable spots. Right here is some of that soft, brand new hoof horn that's formed. Like I said, it's so soft, you don't have to worry about removing too much of this. I'm going to take some of these edges away just because there's some open space behind them that I don't want debris to get into. But typically, these are going to dehydrate and fall away really quickly within the first few days that this hoof horn is exposed. When that hoof horn is on the inside of that claw, it stays hydrated, stays soft. As soon as it works its way out and is exposed to air, then it starts to dehydrate. That's that natural shedding process that it goes through. Here you can see some of that. That's all soft hoof horn in there. Got some edges I got to work on yet, but we're getting there. Notice where that lesion is, though. Nowhere near where we saw that first defect toward the bottom of the claw. Finishing this trim up here, all I got to do is remove some of these hard edges, any of these areas that have a little bit of overhang to them that might trap debris. And then we're going to thoroughly rinse this down, get it wrapped with salicylic acid, and we're going to move on to trim number 2, which has got tons of marks all over this claw. As we let this girl out, she's going to show off a little bit for you and walk backwards. Now on this one, we're working on a back foot, and you're going to notice all the different marks scattered throughout this entire claw. They're everywhere, from the white line in the soles. It's just marks everywhere, and there's a reason for that. Now as I trim this one up, notice the general shape of these claws. Notice how they seem to be overgrown. They're kind of a little bit wider than you're normally seeing. The walls flare out a little bit. That's what I talk about when I'm talking about reading a foot. Understanding what you're seeing as far as the way that hoof is shaped or the problems that it may have faced over time, to understand then why those marks are there. In this case, this cow is exhibiting classic signs of chronic laminitis, or laminitis that she's had over the course of her life that's changed the shape of her hoof and changed the way that it performs or works. In this case, you can see how wide those claws are. There's a reason for that. Typically, that white line is going to be much closer to the inner part of that claw, but here it's widened out. You see a flare toward that outside wall edge. Being able to read the foot and know that is then going to tell me what those marks are in that white line area and why they're there, whether or not they may be problematic or not. It's also going to dictate how I trim this foot. Typically, you notice there, I'm taking that grinder up that wall horn further than I normally would because of these flares. I'm taking some of these flares off of this wall just because they don't need to be there, and they just will persist over time if you don't remove them. They're going to continue to flare even further. So that's why I'm removing further up the wall, keeping this claw more shaped than I typically would. Typically, I'm not going to remove any wall horn anywhere. But in this case, you need to, once again, because I can read this claw. If you look toward the toe area here, you can see how it's got a little bit of a yellowish hue to it. That too is pointing to this chronic laminitis situation that this cow is dealing with. All these marks we see here are just due to the fact that this wall horn doesn't have good attachment points to the inside like it typically would because of that laminitis. Now contrast that with this other claw that we're going to look at here from a different cow. This has got just a tiny little mark in the white line that is problematic, and that just goes back to the differences in these claws, being able to read them and see what is actually happening. With this claw, it was easy. You go to the top, we see a little bit of swelling. We've got some distension in that heel bulb. I know that there's a problem inside of that. Whereas this one, all these little marks here are due to the laminitis, the chronic laminitis over time. So just by having those attachment points not being as firm there, we're going to have hoof horn that's not as sound. But don't worry, we're going to go back and finish that trim. I know you're all saying right now, I want to see the ending of that other trim. We're going to get this one cleaned up, and then we'll finish that one up. These dew claws are a little unruly, so we're going to trim those up as well. Now, back to that third trim. So with these marks like this and being able to read the foot, you just have to know which ones to chase and which ones not to chase, right? That's the whole learning process of becoming a hoof trimmer, is being able to tell which marks are problematic and which ones are not. Just because we see a mark on the outside doesn't necessarily mean we need to chase it and dig them all out of the bottoms of these claws. However, tiny little marks do need to be investigated on some cases just because of this. You'll be able to find them. So it's being able to tell which ones you need to go look for or go after and investigate, and which ones are just superficial. But that takes time to learn that. So that's why in a lot of these cases you might see a claw and be like, oh, you missed that spot right there. There's a defect under there. Well, there isn't a defect under there. It's being able to read that and know which ones are which. And the entire foot kind of paints that picture and tells that story for you once you've learned it. When you're first learning to become a hoof trimmer, every mark you see in that claw, you're sure is going to have a problem underneath. It's going to have an abscess or something there. But most of the time, they don't. When there's lameness, then you know if there's a mark there, likely one of those is going to be the problem. You just have to do a little investigative work, being able to deduce where that likely problem is going to be found, and then concentrating on those areas. With the previous foot, that was something that she was having to deal with for a long time, probably several years. With this one, probably just several hours. This one is very fresh and new, but now we've got it all trimmed up. We're going to get a block on that other claw and get this wrapped up, and we're going to take a look at both of these cows as they stroll away. Hopefully this video has given you a better understanding of what all those little black marks mean. Thanks for watching, guys, and they are done.